Imagine you're walking through a small town in Europe, the kind of place that seems ordinary, untouched by time. Cobblestone streets, faded church bells echoing over empty squares. But then, a rumor surfaces, passed down from the oldest mouths, whispered in corners, never written down. Beneath the church floor, something still breathes. Not a ghost, not a fable, but something the townspeople swore was real, though they buried it in silence. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep, because what you're about to hear has been hidden for over a century, and once you know it, you can't unknow it. The year was 1891. The town of Ravel, quiet and devout, was building an expansion to its only church. Records show an unusual entry in the construction log. Repairs delayed due to strange disturbances. That single note was followed by the disappearance of 2 workers, men whose families swore they walked into the chapel and never walked out. Officials declared it an accident, but no bodies were recovered. The townspeople were told to pray, not to ask questions. And from that day, the whispers began, that under the oak pews and stone altar, something moved in the dark earth. Local legend tells of late-night scratching sounds beneath the church floor, as though nails dragged against stone. Parishioners swore the candles flickered violently during evening mass, though no wind touched the windows. The priest at the time, Father Albrecht, dismissed it as the devil tempting the faithful, but his private diary, later recovered in the town archives, painted a different picture. He described a pulsing beneath the stones, like the breath of a hidden creature. And when the diary was discovered, half its pages had been deliberately torn out. The unsettling part is this: renovations on the church stopped suddenly. No official record explains why, but oral history suggests that whatever they found beneath the floor was sealed up hastily, covered in fresh stone. The priest vanished weeks later, his last sermon unfinished, his words cut off mid-sentence. You see, the people of Ravel still attend that church today. They still kneel on the same floor, above the same stones, and every so often an old villager will tell you, if you ask in the right way, that if you press your ear to the ground during midnight mass, you can still hear something moving. When Father Albrecht vanished, the town of Ravel gave no funeral, no mourning, no official record of his death. In fact, if you search the parish archive, you'll find that his name was quietly erased, as if he never existed. Yet scattered testimonies from townsfolk paint a darker story. An old baker's journal from 1892 notes that the priest had grown pale and paranoid in his final weeks. He insisted on sleeping inside the church, claiming, "Something beneath the altar whispered my name." Several townspeople swore they saw him digging at night, lantern in hand, scraping at the floorboards near the altar. Children dared each other to peek through the cracked church windows, where they claimed to see shadows bending unnaturally, even though only one man stood inside. And then, without warning, he was gone. The church doors were found unlocked, his lantern still burning on the altar, wax pooled and hardened. His diary stopped mid-sentence, the last words written, "It is not dead, it only waits," and then silence. What unsettles historians is not only the absence of his body, but the quiet compliance of the town. No one searched, no one asked. It was as if they wanted him gone, as if the priest himself had become part of the thing beneath the church. A silence fell over the community, the kind of silence born from fear. Rumors spread. Farmers began to report livestock vanishing, hooves clattering in panic during moonless nights. But no blood, no remains, just absence. An undertaker's apprentice, decades later, confessed in a letter that his master was summoned by the parish to dispose of something they refused to name. That letter was never sent. It was found unopened, hidden beneath the floorboards of his home after his death. And still, Mass continued every Sunday. The faithful bowed their heads above whatever stirred below. A chilling duality, public devotion, private, eat dread. To outsiders, Ravel was a quaint village. To those within, every prayer was also a plea. Don't let it rise again. Some say the villagers struck a pact with it, sealing their loyalty in exchange for silence. Others claim the priest's disappearance was a warning, proof that the breathing under the church floor was not meant to be disturbed. But if you visit Ravel today, ask quietly in the tavern. Someone may tell you this. There are nights when the stone floor feels warm, as if something still lives below. Decades passed, but the silence around Ravel's church only deepened. Outsiders who settled in the village often sensed it immediately, a tension that hovered like a fog, an avoidance of questions about the church's foundation. Children were warned never to play near the altar after dark. Brides refused to walk down the aisle at night weddings. And if you ask why, the villagers will shift in their seats, eyes drifting downward, as if watching the floor breathe. In 1924, a new priest, Father Mertens, was assigned to Ravel. His arrival stirred unease. He was a scholar, not a superstitious man, and he questioned the missing records, the erased name of his predecessor. He even tried to recover the torn pages of Albrecht's diary, but they had been burned. That alone alarmed him. Who in the village had wanted to erase that knowledge forever? Father Mertens wrote extensively in his own journals, and fragments survive today. One passage stands out. The floor is alive, not metaphor, not allegory. When I kneel, it shifts beneath me, faint as breath. It exhales dust, the way a dying animal exhales pain. He grew convinced that the church had been built deliberately, not as a house of God, but as a seal over something older. Local archives hint at pre-Christian burial rites on that very hill. Before the church there was a mound. Before the mound, there were stories of a creature bound by stone. Villagers in hushed tones referred to it as the buried saint. Not holy, but feared. They claimed it had once demanded offerings, and when those stopped, the earth itself rebelled. The strongest evidence comes from a renovation report in 1932. Workers described uncovering a hollow cavity beneath the floor, filled with bones. But these were not arranged like graves. They were scattered, splintered, gnawed upon. The report was sealed, labeled, not for parish release. What sort of thing lies beneath a church, breathing, feeding, unseen? Father Mertens died suddenly in 1935, choking during Mass with no cause determined. Some whisper it was not a natural death, but punishment for speaking too much. After his death, his journal was locked away, hidden in the rectory wall, only rediscovered in 1978 when the building was condemned. By then, most of the village no longer attended Mass, though the building stood. The fear fear, however, never left. If you kneel there today, locals say, you may still hear it shifting, the sound of history refusing to stay buried. By the mid-20th century, Ravel's church had gained a reputation that stretched beyond the village borders. Travelers whispered of a place where prayers felt heavy, where the air inside the chapel clung to your skin. Soldiers returning from the war avoided it entirely. Yet official records remain strangely sparse, as though some unseen hand trimmed away the truth each time it threatened to surface. In 1947, a Belgian historian named Clara Voss visited Ravel to document religious architecture. She was fascinated by the church's strange design, floor stones thicker than standard, sealed with iron rivets as if meant to cage rather than support. Villagers warned her not to linger after sunset, but Voss dismissed their superstition. That night, she stayed behind, notebook in hand, sketching the altar. Her notes, still preserved in Brussels, describe the temperature suddenly dropping, the sound of a low thrum beneath the floor, like the vibration of a giant organ pipe buried in earth. She reported hearing a voice, though not in words, more like a pressure in the skull, forcing thought. The next morning she abandoned her studies and left the village in silence. Decades later, in interviews, she admitted she had destroyed half her sketches, fearing they were not safe to look at. Meanwhile, the villagers continued their uneasy truce. Weddings and funerals were rushed affairs, completed before dusk. Midnight mass was abandoned entirely. Strangest of all, the town cemetery stopped accepting new burials in the 1950s. When questioned, the parish committee gave no explanation, yet locals insist the decision was linked to the church floor. They say the ground beneath the altar was full, and that the dead placed nearby never stayed still. Stories circulated of coffins shifting, of earth refusing to hold the bodies. One gravedigger confessed he saw bones unearthed by unseen force, scattered along the churchyard as though spat out. These accounts never made it into newspapers. They lived only in the trembling voices of the elderly, who swore the church was less a sanctuary than a prison, holding something in place, something that did not wish to remain. And yet, despite everything, the people of Ravel kept attending. Why? Because they feared that neglecting the presence beneath would wake it fully. Silence, ritual, and obedience became their shield. But history leaves cracks, and through those cracks the breathing never stopped. By the 1960s, Ravel's church stood like a relic of another age, its stones weathered, its stained glass windows dulled by soot and dust. But behind the crumbling beauty, the whispers continued. Generations had passed since the first disappearances, and yet the townspeople remained bound by an unspoken pact of silence. Outsiders who asked too many questions were given short answers, or sometimes no answers at all. The locals had learned one lesson. The less said, the safer they felt. Still, fragments slipped through. In 1968, a visiting choir performed at the church. Their conductor later described the performance as the most unsettling night of my life. He claimed that during the hymn Dies Irae, the voices of his singers warped, not out of pitch, but as if pulled by another tone resonating beneath them. It was as though the ground was singing back, he wrote. Several choristers fainted, and the performance ended abruptly. They never returned. Around the same time, workers digging new utility lines near the church unearthed stone fragments with symbols carved into them. Scholars later identified these as pre-Christian sigils, linked to burial rites meant not to honor the dead, but to bind the restless. The stones were carted away quietly, yet within weeks strange reports surfaced. Livestock dying suddenly, infants waking screaming every night, villagers swearing they heard knocking sounds echoing from beneath the altar once again. The parish council ordered the floor resealed, though no record explains what, if anything, they found beneath. Witnesses say the work was done only at night, under torchlight, with no explanation offered to the community. And then there were the dreams. By the 1970s, several residents, none related, none conferring with one another, reported the same recurring vision, lying in the church pews, paralyzed, as something beneath the floor breathed steadily, each exhale rattling their bones. They swore the dreams grew stronger if they slept within earshot of the church bells. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony of an elderly woman, recorded in 1974. She whispered to her interviewer, "It doesn't want prayers. It wants us to remember. If we forget it, if we stop gathering here, it will climb out." And so, even as belief in God dwindled, attendance at Ravel's church continued, not out of devotion, but out of dread. By the late 20th century, the Church of Ravel had become more myth than sanctuary. It appeared in obscure journals, it whispered among historians, yet no mainstream account ever dared print its story. What happened beneath those stones was too strange, too threatening to tidy explanations. But fragments of truth emerged, preserved like brittle leaves pressed between forgotten pages. In 1983, a group of architecture students visited Ravel on a field survey. One of them, a young man named Jerome, later described their experience in a letter never meant for publication. He wrote that, while measuring the church interior, they felt an unnatural vibration in the floor. At first, they mistook it for passing traffic, but Ravel was a quiet town. There were no trucks, no trains, no rumbling engines. The vibration came in intervals, like slow, heavy breathing. "It was beneath us," he wrote, "not above, not outside. Beneath." They fled before nightfall, abandoning their sketches. Years later, when interviewed, Jerome refused to elaborate. He would only say, "That place remembers you once you've been inside. You can leave, but it doesn't let go." The villagers by then lived in uneasy coexistence. They spoke less of faith and more of obligation. A candle was always kept burning on the altar even if no mass was held. A local mason was quietly paid to repair cracks in the stone each decade, ensuring the seal remained unbroken. These rituals were not church doctrine. They were survival. And yet, every so often, the balance wavered. A child reported seeing shadows moving independently of candlelight. A farmer claimed he awoke to find soil scattered across the church steps, damp and clinging, as if the ground itself had shifted upward. In the 90s, a storm shattered the stained glass, and villagers swore they heard a deep, guttural sound roll through the nave, something too steady to obey thunder. The strangest testimony came from a nun who briefly served in Ravel. She left abruptly, later confiding to a friend that each night she heard words whispered through the floorboards, not in Latin, not in Flemish, but in a language she did not know. "It was speaking," she said, "and the worst part is, I think it wanted me to answer." The church still stands, its doors unlocked. Inside, the air tastes of stone and ash, and beneath the silence, some swear, the breathing continues. The 21st century brought cameras, recorders, endless digital eyes. And yet, when it comes to Ravel's church, very little survives. Tourists occasionally wander in, unaware of its reputation, but they seldom linger. Some describe their footage becoming corrupted, audio warped, video frames skipping, as if the building itself resisted being documented. A few investigators have tried to capture proof of what breathes beneath the floor, but their work rarely leaves the village. Local officials dismiss these stories as rumor. Still, when pressed, they refuse to let anyone excavate the foundation. One incident, whispered among locals, occurred in 2009. A group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night inside the church. Only one spoke afterward. His story is fractured, incoherent, but one phrase remains consistent. It woke up when we laughed. The others have never spoken publicly. Some moved away. Some still live in Ravel, but their silence is complete. Even now, there are villagers who perform their quiet rituals, lighting candles, whispering prayers they no longer believe in. They are not keeping faith. They are keeping balance. Ask them why, and they will tell you nothing. But watch their eyes, and you will see the truth. The fear never left. The church has no signpost, no plaque, no tourist brochure. To most of the world, it is nothing but another forgotten building in a forgotten town. But if you walk its aisle, you will feel it. The stone beneath your feet, older than the church, older than the village. Some say it's not just a thing buried there, but a memory, a curse that breathes with the rhythm of centuries. The question that lingers is this: what will happen when the floor finally cracks? The villagers can repair the stones, reseal the rivets, patch the fractures, but stone does not last forever. And if the breathing grows stronger, if the silence falters, if the pact is broken, then perhaps the church will no longer be a prison. Perhaps it will become a doorway. And when that day comes, Ravel will not be the only place to hear what rises.